It's May the 1st and I've come to a wood near my home to count the early purple orchids. I first found these in 2011 when I counted 38 spikes. In 2017 these had increased to 112. Let's see how many there are now after last summer's long drought and very high temperatures, which probably stressed the plants. "59, 60, 61, and that seems to be it." Well, that's it, just 61 this year. Next year there could be double that or half that, or it could even disappear. The early purple orchid is notorious for coming and going, completely unpredictably. In some of the local woodlands, it's now reached peak bluebell. This peacock butterfly won't be snacking on bluebells much longer. It's already some 9 months old. Quite geriatric for a butterfly. The rather more subdued looking flowers of the herb Robert are very popular with the snouted hoverfly. Whereas the caterpillars of the peacock butterfly have fed on nettles, this spent its larval life in a cowpat. It thrusts its long telescopic proboscis deep into the flower, questing for the nectar. When fully extended, this proboscis is nearly as long as the hoverfly's body. Right now, the common gorse on the coast is forming a magnificent display. This is perfect stonechat habitat, which is why I'm here. This male is bringing in a constant supply of caterpillars for his brood of nestlings. They're situated deep inside the protective thorns of the gorse bush. This one was busy hopping around, snapping up St. Mark's flies, which are swarming all over the place. So let's take a closer look at those now. This is a male taking a break from his swarming activities to groom himself. He has very large bulbous eyes meeting on top of the head. These enable him to keep his place in the swarm and spot an incoming female. As you can see, she has much smaller eyes, and she's much larger than the male. The males swarm in thousands above the grassy meadows where they spent their life as larvae, among the roots of the grasses. The males hatch first and form these large swarms before the females start emerging. The males are thus in a perfect position to intercept females as they emerge and take their first adult flight upwards into the swarm. Whether she makes the choice of a specific male selected from the swarm, or whether they make a grab for her, isn't currently known. What we do know is that they actually copulate in flight and then fly down towards vegetation on the ground. Once settled, they remain in copula for a lengthy period, often an hour or more. The male, with his broad head and bulbous eyes, is on the left, and the female, with her narrow head and small eyes, is on the right. In early May, the cliff tops are at their brilliant best, a wonderful carpet of flowers. This is thrift, very resistant to the salt spray that plasters the cliffs in winter storms. This is sea campion, also exclusively found on the coast. spring squirrel is one of my favourites, a tiny relative of the bluebell, hugging the short turf, usually in countless thousands. Back in the less harsh conditions inland, the hazels are in leaf and the oaks are in flower. I always look forward to seeing the strange and rather curious looking blooms of the cuckoo pint or lords and ladies. I was really fascinated by these as a child. Later in the year they're followed by orangey red berries. Whenever I find a plant of hedge garlic or jack by the hedge, I'm always hoping that an orange-tipped butterfly will come by. Here we have two resting on the flowers, extremely well camouflaged. Can you see them? With the wings open, the orange wingtips of the males are very obvious, but the females have white upper wings. When the sun goes in, the male quickly closes his wings and becomes much more difficult to spot. With the sun welcomely out again, this female is busy laying her eggs on the flower heads. Just as she's really getting down to her egg laying, she's suddenly rudely interrupted by a male. He's not interested in the fact she's laying eggs because she's already mated. He wants to fertilise any future eggs that she lays. After a fairly hectic session of courtship, he finally gives up and flies off to a nearby flower for a snack. But it seems that this particular male is not going to give up easily, and after a few seconds on the flower, back he goes to the chase. Although the male's fluttering seems rather aimless, there are in fact two themes to this courtship. The first is visual. He's fluttering his bright orange wings next to the female's eyes. The second part involves scent. He's bombarding the female with scent particles broken off from his wings. They form a veritable shower of pheromone-rich scent bombs. After a successful courtship, they copulate back to back. They normally rest on vegetation, in this case on a flower of the actual food plant. With night approaching, an hour later, they'd split up. Next morning, they were still on the same flower. As the sun gradually warmed things up, they slowly opened their wings. Because for orange tips, no sun means no activity. I thought the male might try to mate again, but it seemed that he remembered that the nearby female was his former mate, and he flew off without attempting to touch her. There's just time to fit in a quick breakfast, and then he's back at it again. See how the female is holding her abdomen up vertically as a signal of rejection. The "not today, dear" gesture. Sometimes the males get so desperate that they'll persist in courtship of a female of a different species, in this case a female brimstone. Meanwhile, most birds, like this song thrush, are searching for food to feed their nestlings. Working so hard involves quite a bit of wear and tear on the plumage. Preening therefore becomes quite important as part of the day's activities. This is a robin. Preening is just as important for this magpie. And even more vital for this blue tit, which has to slave away because it has such a huge brood of hungry males to feed. All over the countryside now, the hawthorn trees are bursting into flower. Appropriately enough, this is often called May blossom. Now is a time for the insect numbers to reach their maximum. You can see just why so many migratory birds make the long, difficult haul up from Africa to cash in on this bonanza of food. This chaffinch is surrounded by flying insects. Now it's mid-May, but the ash trees are not yet in leaf. I've come to this beautiful site in the Camel Valley to look for one particular special butterfly. The pearl-bordered fritillary. This is one of the few remaining sites in Cornwall for a butterfly that has declined massively over the last few years throughout the whole country. The caterpillars eat the leaves of violets. However, strangely enough, the female doesn't lay her eggs directly on the violet plants. Instead, she deposits them on grass or bracken or other vegetation close to the plants. While busy with the butterflies, I spotted a western bee fly laying eggs. This is quite a rare species in Britain. By contrast, the shiny black blobby larva of the bloody nose beetle is a common sight chewing away on goosegrass leaves. By now, the hazel trees are in full leaf. This is the signal for the female of the hazel leaf-rolling weevil to set to work, fashioning the living cradles in which her larvae will spend their lives. This is a lengthy and complex task. She begins by cutting a slit from the edge of the leaf along to the midrib. This takes about half an hour of constant hard work, chewing away at the tough leaf with her tiny jaws. Once this is accomplished, she can trot round the back of the leaf and start folding it lengthwise. The amount of power that she displays in her tiny legs is amazing for such a small insect. She now begins the laborious task of rolling the leaf up from the tip. This is an agonisingly slow and strenuous process. Now and again, she has to trot across the leaf in order to continue the rolling process from the opposite side. Bear in mind that just an hour or so ago, she started with a leaf like the one on her left. She's nearing the end now. One of her final tasks is to flip the leaf roll down into a vertical position. There it goes. She lays several eggs within her cradle. Within its interior, several larvae can feed on the living tissue of the leaf, out of sight. Just bear in mind that the ability to carry out this whole complex routine is hardwired within her tiny brain. Females often work alone, but they're also often accompanied by their mate. He remains in position on her back in order to repel any intruding males who might try and fertilise any of the eggs she's about to lay. The need for such a strategy is obvious here. An intruding male is vigorously trying to push her mate off the female's back. If you're not quite sure just how small our subject is, just look at my intruding finger. Talking of small things, early May is the time for the tiny babies of the garden spider to hatch from the overwintered egg cases. And even some large puddles are full of tadpoles. Down at the bottom of my garden, a male of our commonest species of wolf spider is waving his palps in courtship signalling to a female on the left. He's on to a real loser though. She's simply not interested. She's already mated and laid her eggs, carried in the whitish sac at the tip of her body. In the end, she gets fed up with his antics and drives him away. When the babies eventually hatch from the mother's egg sac, they crawl onto her back, forming a sort of ball of babies. This male slowbug, on the left, and named after the fruits called sloes, is being equally unsuccessful. He's gently butting his head beneath the female's body in what proved to be a futile attempt to get her to accept him as a mate. On a nearby flowerhead, a second male is having equally poor success. On a dock leaf close by, the dock bugs are also playing the mating game. These don't belong to the same family as the slowbug. All this fascinating activity is taking place in a tiny wild area left aside in my garden. Here I allow plants such as buttercups to flower. Here being visited by a red-headed cardinal beetle. It's busy nibbling away on the buttercup pollen. It's amazing what you can find in a garden, but for one special insect, it was time for me to pay a visit to the coast. I've come to these sand dunes on the north coast of Cornwall to look at these snail shells. They've long since ceased to provide shelter for their owners, but they now provide a home for a fascinating new occupier, the gold-fringed mason bee. At this stage, she's busy bringing in pollen to stock a nest cell within the snail shell. Once she has fully stocked a nest cell, her next task is to seal it up with chewed up leaves, forming a kind of mastic. When I came back the next day, she'd been really busy and had already sealed up the shell's gaping aperture. See how she carefully uses her jaws to mould the mastic into place, spreading it across the damp surface. Then it's back to the source of her material, a nearby plant, for a fresh supply. To and fro she goes, never seeming to tire, extending her coverage across the shell. Strangely enough, she is exclusively gathering her supplies from a plant which is not native here. This is the evening primrose, which hails from North America, but has gone wild on these dunes. When she gets back to the shell, she walks around, checking to see where the next batch of mastic needs to be applied. Before leaving, she makes a quick circuit around the shell to make sure that she actually does need some more supply. Then it's back to my garden. I left a few nettles in place, and these are now host to some tiny small tortoiseshell butterfly caterpillars. These are not much thicker than a cotton thread. 10 days later, and they've really grown. The nettles are now beginning to look a bit threadbare, and I'm glad I left them in place. The head flicking is a reaction they make to intruding parasitic wasps and flies. We're now in the middle of May. The rather featureless blob of the bloody-nosed beetle larva has now turned, via a pupa, into a conventional looking adult. But, like the larva, it still chews away happily on goosegrass leaves. Now is also the time for the sudden appearance, all over the place, of the large bulb fly, common in my garden. It can be a pest when its larvae develop inside garden bulbs such as tulips and daffodils. During the whole time that he spent mating, this male was vigorously buzzing his wings. This seemed to be an encouragement to the female to accept him and actually mate fully, something they're not actually doing at the moment. The female wasn't playing ball. See how she's trying to push him away with her back legs. Out on Bodmin Beacon, it's white flower time. This is Guelder and this is the rowan, also known as the mountain ash. Its massed flowers spread rather a sickly sweet scent into the surrounding air, which I find rather unpleasant. But the hive bees seem to like it, and they visit the flowers in some numbers. By September, this results in masses of red berries, very attractive to birds. I'm up on Bodmin Moor, and this small hawthorn tree, yet to come into leaf, is absolutely plastered with one of the beard lichens, this particular one being called the string of sausages lichen. It's very common in this area, here up on the moor. Like most lichens, it needs the unpolluted atmosphere that you find quite easily here in Cornwall. It derives its common name from some of the thickened strands. These rather resemble a string of sausages. In the boggy areas, the striking little bog beacon fungus is a typical springtime species, while the striking pink flowers of the lousewort are characteristic of poor acidic soils. The blackbird's song is sublime. The depressingly grey sky above is not. In the summer of 2021, blue skies were rare. When the cloud finally did thin somewhat, I headed to Port Quin. Along there up on the left was an excellent place to see whitethroats. Male whitethroats deliver their scratchy song at some length from a perch. Then now and again they launch into a very brief song flight before returning to the same perch or a different one. The coast path ran straight through this male's territory, so he had no problem with people. You could stand as close as you liked. This was also typical linnet habitat. On the exposed northern cliffs, there were carpets of kidney vetch. Over most of Britain, and in fact most of Cornwall, yellow is the only colour you get. However, in parts of Cornwall, and in Pembrokeshire on the coast, you also get a variety of colours, especially pink. On these cliff tops, several colours were intermixed. Queens of the brown-banded carder bee rely heavily on kidney vetch for their early spring foraging. Nationally, this bee has undergone a massive decline. The Cornish coast is now one of its few remaining strongholds in the British Isles. Just below the colourful carpets of kidney vetch, the rugged coast provides perfect habitat for the rock pipit. After long sessions spent preening themselves, the males eventually launch into their high, soaring, rather spectacular song flight. The rate of climb is fantastic. To the naked eye, it quickly goes out of sight. You can only see it now because I'm using a telephoto lens. Between such strenuous bouts of activity, it seems that keeping the feathers in shape really is vital in order to keep flying efficiently. Apart from the massive quantities of kidney vetch, the cliffs were also alive with other flowers. This is sea plantain. While the rock sea sparrow prefers exposed cliff faces. The common scurvy grass drenched the surrounding air with its delightfully sweet fragrance. Rather surprisingly, these windswept, treeless cliffs are home to woodland plants such as primroses and bluebells. By contrast, the south coast is much less exposed. This pipit is enjoying a hectic but very successful hunt for insects on a sheltered beach. As you've just heard, this beach was also popular with sunbathers, but the pipit wasn't the least bit worried. And nor were these ruddy turnstones. These don't breed in Cornwall, but at most times of the year a few can be found walking around on the coast. They feed by using their beaks to chisel small molluscs off the rocks. As the tide recedes, the thick top shells become active, grazing on the seaweeds. In the shallow pools stranded by the receding waters, you can easily find large numbers of the attractive flat top shell. The pink rock it's crawling over is actually an encrusting seaweed. The common periwinkle often occurs in thousands. But you'd be lucky to spot a tiny Rostanga rubra sea slug. Unlike the snake-lox anemone on the left, the gem on the right does not have mobile tentacles. The most abundant sea anemone by far is the beadlet. The much larger strawberry anemone used to be regarded just as a form of the beadlet, but is now treated as its own species. This tiny cushion star changes from male to female during its development. It's a scavenger, feeding on decaying plant and animal material. This is the only time I've ever seen one swimming freely around in a rock pool. Normally you only find them under stones at low tide. This was also the only time that I ever found a giant specimen of the common spider crab left behind in a deep pool. They lived long enough for the carapace to become colonised by barnacles. The absence of water at low tide is the signal for the green leafworm to prowl amongst the rocks looking for prey. Inland, there's an absence of roar from the wind or the sea. The cow parsley is now forming a white border to many a lakeside. These so-called white-flowered umbelliferas can be confusingly similar, even for a botanist. This, for example, is pignut. It has edible roots, as its name suggests. It's much smaller than cow parsley, and its leaves are very finely divided by comparison. Up above, the fluffy willow seeds are flying in all directions. And now, it's time to introduce the wedding present spider. That white blob, held in this male's jaws, is an insect wrapped in silk. It's a wedding present that he's about to present to the female. He needs to use his gift in order to persuade the female to accept him as a mate. But first, he has to get close enough for her to realise that he's bearing a tasty gift. Eventually, he employs the gift to entice her under the leaf, and they mate. Success, and quickly at that. But then, disaster. My tripod overbalanced and knocked them off their leaf. That was the end of it, or so I thought. But this turned out to be my lucky evening. The male was game to have another go. Back he came, and the whole thing kicked off again in front of my lens. With jerky movements, he eases towards her. Then he pauses and rocks back on his legs to expose the gift for her inspection. As she makes a sudden move towards him, he rocks even further back on his legs to expose the gift full in her face. Suddenly, she makes a positive move. She eases forward and begins chewing on the gift. But the male still has one final problem. He still has to manoeuvre the female into a suitable position to enable him to insert his palps and complete the mating sequence. With a fair degree of jerky persuasion, he finally achieves this. By now it's quite late in the day, and the low angle of the sun is getting rather awkward for filming. So there we are, the male comfortably mating, while the female chews away on her present. This was all filmed in my garden, hence the background noises. That same evening, the blackbirds on Bodmin Beacon were in good voice. In the early evening light, the willow warblers were still in full song. With the ruby glow of the setting sun illuminating its feathers, a wood pigeon quietly preens. In a shaft of evening sunlight down below, the winter gnats are still performing their intricate aerial courtship dance. But not for much longer. The warmth of the advancing summer will soon put a stop to all this, at least until the cooler days of autumn arrive. Male chaffinches seem to spend more time employing their zip-zip call than in full song. On the far side of the beacon, two song thrushes in adjacent trees were engaging in a sort of song fight. As I was filming the song thrushes, a bumblebee suddenly flew in and alighted on a nearby trunk. It spent some time combing pollen off its furry body. You can't help but notice the large masses of yellow pollen already in place on the hind legs. It was probably making its last trip of the day back to its nest. And now, with the time well after 9 o'clock, join me and just sit and listen to the beautiful sounds of Cornwall in May.